Good evening, everyone.
Good
Good
evening.
evening.
So Dogen Zenji, our founder, goes to China, and he is in search of answering his very deep koan, which is, if we are all awakened, why is it necessary to practice? So in most accounts, Dogen Zenji has a big experience, and then he receives Dharma transmission and he comes back to Japan, and he brings with him this important teaching that he has received. And he is anxious to transmit it, to say, look, this is something profound and important that I have received, and I want to share it with everyone. So he's a bit rebuffed. He is not well accepted at the temple he returns to. And so he goes to yet another temple, and the politics of the time are very, very difficult. And so he is offered a temple and property up north in Fukui Prefecture, and so he decides to go up there. And he has a fairly small retinue that he takes with him, maybe about 6 priests or so. And so he begins to teach, and one of the first things he does is to write the Fukansa Zengi, which is what we are taking up right now with Harada Roshi. He begins this book with the Fukansa Zengi, which is essentially Dogen Zenji's prescription for how to sit zazen. And so Harada Roshi begins telling us what Dogen Zenji writes. And it's this very absolutist prescription that he gives us about the Buddha Dharma. But then in the very next paragraph, after he does that, he says, now of course that's Dogen Zenji speaking from this very high place of experience and understanding, this absolute position. He says, but we are mere mortals. We are human beings, and for us the mind is quite complex, and for us we have to speak in a little bit more different terms and understand the difficulties that we have of the mind that we find ourselves in. So Harada Roshi is going to, I believe, as he has done in other works that we have read by him, he is going to straddle this position between the absolute and the relative world, this absolute teaching that Dogen Zenji gives us, and the relative world of our own state that we are in our wish to become awakened. So he's going to straddle that, and he's going to try and draw an even line and show the importance of experience and the importance of practice. So adjacent to that, I came across this paper. I'm on academia.org, which is a website that is mostly academic people, but not all academics. You could be on there if you have papers that you want to share with the world. People from all over the world. There are hundreds of thousands of people who participate on that. And so I got interested in this particular paper, and it's called The Role of Compassion in Actualizing Dogen Zen, and is by Professor George Risley. He's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Georgia. So he's very interested in what is the role of emotion in the experience of one practicing Dogen Zen Buddhism. I mean, for many of us, we wonder, are we supposed to rid ourselves of all emotion? Are we supposed to never laugh or cry, or just be some people who are absent of any sense of feeling. And we know that that is not true, and it is not a correct way to think either. But he had a very interesting thesis then. So he says, as the question concerns experience, we already come upon one of the main contentions of this paper, namely, that contrary to much of what has been written in the 20th century about Zen, both in Japan and in the West, Dogen Zen is not primarily concerned with cultivating the experience of enlightenment, but rather the enactment of enlightenment through bodily activities. So I found that a very, very interesting thesis, because Dogen is certainly going to tell us that, and we say together that practice is important. We form our body into the shape of the Buddha, and we sit as Buddha, reenacting or enacting, he says, enactment of enlightenment through bodily activities. So the paper is quite interesting, and ultimately the paper is making a bridge, because the writer is looking for this emotional place that we find in Zen practice, and what is the role of that emotional stance that is the bridge between the absolute and the relative, and how do we bridge those two? So I think Professor Risley is not saying one or the other, but experience and enactment of physical practice. And I think that we could agree, as Professor writes, that compassion and wisdom are the bridges that we find in the Bodhisattva progression. That practice without the awakening of compassion is perhaps fails to really have taken root in us. So he says or suggests that compassion is that emotional place, and the experience of awakening without compassion is not a true awakening. I'm saying that. So compassion and wisdom are primary in Zen practice. And so compassion then is this bridge that is necessary for us to take Zazen as our practice from the point of its being selfish or self-centered or concerned with us and ego developing, and placing it out in the world in which we act in the world with compassion and wisdom. So this point of moving practice into the world is essential, and certainly in our time. Soto Zen has been accused of being silent in addressing the world's needs, or of just being altogether too silent in the practice itself. So in these times, and awakening to the appropriateness of practice in our time is to really understand how we cross that bridge to both in awakening and in serving the needs of others. Because it is not a selfish act. It must not be a selfish act. It cannot be a selfish act to sit Zazen. Zazen is egoless, so immediately it is not selfish. And I think what is helpful in this particular teaching, that I think that Harada Roshi does also, is that for many of us, we have not had some big experience of awakening, and yet we trust that as we sit and as we practice, that is what we are doing, an enactment of awakening. It is what we are doing. We are sitting in the same posture as the Buddha. And even if our mind is in Zanzibar, we are still sitting. And showing up on the cushion is 98% of it. Being there is 98%. Of course, that paying attention in Zazen and having those Zazens where we're so awake and we are right there leads us and convinces us and helps us to understand that we can continue and what the importance of practice is. So we are going to continue in this strain with Harada Roshi, who leans toward the experience as being very important. Now, I know that there are those in Zen practice today who would deny even Dogen Zenji's big awakening and think that there wasn't anything really big that happened with Dogen Zenji when he went to China, that he didn't have some big awakening, but it was just the influence of his teacher in practice. But I would totally disagree with that. Dogen says, although the inconceivable Dharma is abundant in each person, it is not actualized without practice, and it is not experienced without realization. So it's not a awakening or enactment, it's and put together. It's both of those put together that are primary for us in our practice, essential to us in practice. And, the notion that the awakening or enlightenment is some bizarre kind of wild, far-out experience that is going to transform us such that we won't be able to speak to one another, or we will shed our clothing and go out naked into the world and we will do all of these crazy things. It's not correct, and it's not true at all. Truth is that an awakening experience is awakening of the most natural mind that we have. It is just perhaps a leaving behind the self-inflicted ideas that we carry around. We carry around the most bizarre notions about ourselves and who we are. We don't stick needles and knives to cause wounds in our body, and yet we self-inflicted ideas wound the mind, and we have no problem doing that to ourselves for some reason that I can't quite figure out. But we come to practice to learn and to train ourselves to understand the natural nature of the true self. It is what our task is. Next time you gather up all of this foment going in you, think about it as self-inflicted. So the awakening experience itself is simply the most natural state of mind that you could be in. Yes, it's profound and experiential, totally erasing ego, not forever, but in the experience itself. But it is just natural. It's just natural state, without all of the encumbrances that we have piled on ourselves by right of accumulation of infliction. Wrong ideas. And particularly today, with all that we have to contend with in our culture and in our society and in our world and the enormous needs of the world, it behooves us to allow ourselves to come to this unencumbered state of mind such that we can serve in the world in the best way possible. So that we can really understand that Zazen is egoless, and that is the way that we come our best posture of mind into the world to save ourselves. We save ourselves first. So perhaps somebody has a question? Yes.
I want to be clear on how these things relate. It's this idea that Dogen Zenji is writing from this absolute place, and how we have to talk about it from a very different perspective as we are mere mortals. And this idea that when we sit zazen, there is no ego. So this idea that we bring these like wounds or these pains into our sitting doesn't seem to be applicable to sitting, because when we take the form, those things drop away.
Mm-hmm.
But when we come out of zazen, I mean, the world remains.
Yes, it does.
And we have to deal with that.
Yes.
So how do the wounds of the ego, I mean, how do we deal with that in the waking world?
Our practice is Zazen, and our practice is Zazen in the waking world. And we bring Zazen into the wounds, not the wounds into Zazen.
But we must deal with the wounds.
Yes, we must. But we bring Zazen into them. Just as if you, when you sit Zazen, we clear ourselves. To the best possible, we clear ourselves of those wounds.
In a relative sense, I must acknowledge that, like, the wounds of the world are real.
Yes,
in
they
order
are.
to address them. So what is bringing Zazen into them? Does it take the problems away?
No, there will always be problems. There will always be suffering. But our practice is to relieve suffering and first of all, to relieve the suffering of our own lives first.
What is it to hold suffering and zazen at the same time?
Is it your own suffering?
Any suffering, so yes.
Well, one's personal suffering drops away, ultimately in practice.
In the absolute.
No, in real living.
How can we address problems?
One's personal suffering, my particular bent toward my own suffering, drops away. There's no need for it after a time.
For a time.
Why would I continue to suffer if I can drop it off? Acknowledging that the world is full of suffering. And there's no end to it. We say so in the Heart Sutra. No extinction of it. Also no suffering and no extinction of it. So we continue to bring our best state into the world to allow it to resonate in a world of suffering. To say to somebody else, come and sit Zazen, practice Zazen. Maybe after about 5 or 6 years, you will begin to release some of the grind of whatever particular bent toward suffering that we have each chosen. Because we've each chosen some methodology of suffering. And then, how much do you want to suffer? If you don't want to suffer anymore, you will stop suffering. It's really like that.
I just feel like there's this innate, like this, there's, a process in which acknowledging suffering is a part of the healing.
Yeah, I can say so, sure.
Where it is probably inappropriate to imagine it having dropped away
Well,
if it's still dictating our environment and our life.
if we are continuing to suffer, we will continue to suffer until we see through it and decide that we just don't want to do that anymore, because it isn't necessary to hold personal suffering.
How is this not escape though? Because
It's
it's
not an
not
escape.
suffering itself part of awakening?
Yes, and then there is awakening and awakening and awakening, and there is no end to it. But personal suffering does not have to cling on to one in life at some point in practice. It's no longer useful. At some point, it's not. Yes.
Is what you're saying is that sometimes, quite a lot of times, I might be sitting on the cushion and I'm really not meditating, I'm not contemplating, I'm just whirling around in my head about my own problems. Is that what you're saying? And that by continually doing your best to pull your mind back from that and go on with your practice is the method for allowing that to drop away?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I mean, that's the best we can do. We can't come to the cushion every time. And, I mean, we had a tired zazen tonight. People are tired tonight. I get a sense about that. That people get sleepy after a day's work, and it gets dark early. And so there's a bit of tiredness. And so maybe we don't sit in some spectacular attention presence that we might have at other times. And it's always like that. It's like breathing in and out. We breathe, and sometimes there's great presence, and sometimes there's not. And yet we continue. We always continue, because the placing of ourselves in zazen is an enactment of awakening. So. I know maybe people might think I'm kidding about suffering, but honest to goodness, the question is, how much do you want to suffer? How much do you want to? You can do it, you can suffer all you want, but you don't have to either. I'm talking about our personal suffering. And sickness is not necessarily suffering in the same way that we are talking about. Pain is not the same as suffering. So, how much do you want to do it? Yeah.
Edo-san,
Yeah.
I'm struggling with the teaching because I have been seeking a path to drop great inner suffering
Yes.
that I've carried for my whole
Yes.
life. And sometimes have experiences of despair.
Yes.
So I know you're not being flip.
No, I'm not.
I simply offer in response to you the grinding despair that I sometimes experience, and wonder what's wrong with me or my practice.
Clinging to an identity of suffering. I mean, I don't know, because I don't know you so well, and we're also in a public place together. deeply admire your ability to say that out here and to discuss that. But, as Will said, one does have to acknowledge one's suffering, but one has to look at the mechanism of how it arises. That is a really important matter to take care of. How do these self-inflicted ideas and thoughts arise that put us in that state? That is what has to be looked at, the mechanism of it. Not just that it arises and then I entertain myself with the suffering, and I'm not being flip, I don't mean it. I came to practice because of profound suffering in my life. I cried on the cushion every day for 2 years. I would wake up crying. And so, but at some point, I thought, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? So one must see beyond that. One must see something outside of our own selves. Practice is not, zazen is not an interior matter. It is a sitting with everything, sitting with others. When we sit with others, compassion develops in us. If we see compassionately, this is the bridge that awakens. So we really have to make that distinction between personal suffering and the suffering that will go on, great suffering in the world. There is no doubt about it. But personal suffering is what most of us are working with. And so that becomes the question to ourselves. How much do I want to continue suffering?
But I find it necessary to distinguish suffering, because people do go into despair,
Mm-hmm.
and they go into mania. We go into all kinds of states, being human beings, and they're beautiful. And it's like, you can do that and not suffer from it. Or maybe it's just not suffering per se, it's just an experience to the far reaches of the mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the idea, but honoring the richness of the human experience, I think, is what makes
Absolutely.
life beautiful.
Absolutely. And I am not suggesting that one leaves behind one emotional palette. We have a full emotional palette that we go with, and sometimes we're sad, and sometimes we're so forth and so on. But the grinding, deep down suffering that would root us in suffering has to lift. That's what we have to give away.
But doesn't that come by entering reality as it arises?
Big R?
Without trying to control it or make it something that it is not.
Well, I have to ask, what is the depth of practice? Are you on the cushion to examine what the mechanism is that causes a deep connection and attachment to suffering that just continues to arise?
But I can't imagine that entails denying any emotion.
I am not suggesting that there's a denial of emotion. I'm just saying, what's the attachment to debilitating suffering?
It's like the difference between feeling it or not.
Say again, please.
It's like the difference between feeling what you're feeling or not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe, but what's practice about?
It's about not getting rid of anything.
Accepting everything. And you should also be able to accept awakening.
Are they different?
I think there's a relief of suffering, we're talking about debilitating suffering that people have.
But that doesn't mean you won't still cry.
I cry, you're always gonna cry.
That's not suffering though, is it?
It could be or it couldn't be.
Who's to decide?
Well, you have to decide for yourself. Nobody can tell you. But at some point, there is a relief of personal suffering. To me, I don't think that practice makes sense otherwise.
How do you prove that to another person?
Why do I have to?
Then how do you know the difference?
Because I moved through it myself. I personally stopped doing the things that caused me such terrible personal turmoil. I said, why would I live that way? Why do we live that way? Why? I do not have to have my mind behave that way. I do not have to inflict my mind with those turmoils that cause me to just live in a state of utter darkness.
I think that
We have choices.
I understood like awakening to be sort of this openness
Yes.
where we just allow everything as it arises without control.
Yeah.
So there's no control of the mind, it's just complete.
There is certainly a release from the ego attachment of suffering.
But isn't that by not controlling the mind? Is that not what
Well,
samadhi
it's not a point of control. It's a point of the experience is transforming. Just as zazen is transforming. The practice of zazen is transforming.
without our need to do anything.
Well, we need to
Show up.
We need to show up 90%. How many, is that the percent I gave? It's at least 90. And then to be present, to practice being present. And in that, we see through the things that beguile us. that we see through them and we say, well, I don't need that anymore. I don't need to do that to myself anymore.
You're not getting rid of anything but the attitude.
Well, I think that, we still have in us all of the potential of emotion and so forth and so on. It depends on what choices I want to make with the attitude of where do I want to hang out. Confucius says, make sure you hang out with good friends. And it's the same sort of thing. And Shakyamuni Buddha says, don't eat the leftovers that will poison you. The leftover junk in your head. Don't eat that. The same as you throw out the leftovers from your refrigerator that are become poison. So do the leftovers in your head. Don't need them. You're not going to eat them. Don't eat them. Don't swallow them down. We have choices. We always have choices. So we're talking about what do we want to engage in when we're talking, so we can return to zombie mind, just to tag on to that. What choices do we make, do we entertain in our heads? And those are huge choices that we can make. Do I want to hang out in my dread and my fear and all of the possibilities that I could make up. Do I want to hang out there? Why? Why? And yet, the palette is full. The palette is available. Complete palette of emotion is available to us.
The despair is really good for poetry.
Yeah, so's loneliness. And then the best emotion that doesn't have a color or a sound or anything is grief. Grief by far is the deepest, most profound, most difficult of all the emotions because we can't find it in ourselves, and yet it can foment, and it takes different shapes and different expressions. So it's very hard to find and identify, and yet it's the deepest of all of the emotions.
And so important right now.
It's deeply, deeply important, and we should acknowledge that there is great grief, and we can experience great grief without suffering, without personal suffering. Yes, Allison.
There's so much going through my head. There's certain types of sadness and grief that are very clean to me because there's not that muddy self-interest involved. I mean, the self is here, yes, but that's all. It's not muddied by that.
Yes.
And I was also thinking of when I first learned to sit zazen. One of the instructions was to allow everything to arise and pass away as I'm sitting. And that includes our thoughts, emotions. But what I notice over and over and over is, of course, that with one thought, if I let that other thought start, then I'm into a story.
Mm-hmm.
And once I get lost in that, there's suffering.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about necessarily controlling your thoughts, saying I'm not going to think that doesn't work. But there's a turning sometimes I can make.
Yes.
And returning to the self that I am here. And so that happens, and I think the same mechanism can happen when I'm off the cushion.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
For me, it's noticing that I'm suffering, and then if I notice and examine it, then I can let go of whatever thought or story that because
Mm-hmm.
I've been making up stories my whole life, about my whole life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there was a connection there somewhere to zombie mind. Oh, for me, I think the zombie mind is just letting those stories run. Letting all the old mind habits that have caused suffering run, instead of noticing. And for me, a lot of the work is just noticing, and if I'm present, I'm noticing. And
Yeah.
it's not that it necessarily goes away right away, but I can examine what I can let go
Mm-hmm.
of maybe some of the things that are causing it.
Yeah. So this turning that you said is really important. Remember Don was here talking, Martin Buber talks about the turning. And this is an important practice that we have, that we can always make this turning in which we can choose, going on the train, we can choose to go on another track. We can always take another track. We can have that turning, which is a spiritual moment in which we break the habit of the storytelling. It's not that it's gone, It isn't that you're not going to remember, but in that moment of turning, that spiritual action of turning, you release the emotional attachment to it, so that you aren't overcome, not you, but we aren't overcome by it, or not, we're not afflicted by it. We have a choice. Okay, that's our practice. Our practice is to turn. Our practice is to allow, always to allow. We don't stuff problems in. We allow them, we look, and we turn.
Some
Yeah.
clarification. Earlier you mentioned that our sitting, we are enacting awakening. And in that enacting, we are acknowledging whatever arises in us, including the stories, the many stories that we weave for ourselves. And I mean, the distinction that I'm making in my mind about this is that we have a choice to enact the story in our lives that crops up, or we can enact awakening,
Yes,
which sees through the story
yes, that's good.
and then go from there.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's what suffering is to enact it over and over and over again, and to repeat it constantly so that we are embedded in the weight of it.
I mean, a zombie mind in some way are fully enacting the stories we tell ourselves, and
certainly
just
can be.
living through
It
that,
certainly can be.
and then we're dead.
It certainly can be, yeah.
All right.
You had another bill? Yeah.
No, I'm just,
Okay.
I'm just
Cogitating.
and turning.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. All right, thank you very much, everyone.